You know how halfway through Season 5 there was a 2-month gap between episode 13 and 14? Yeah, like the show itself, I don't have much of an excuse. But My Little Pony Friendship is Magic Season 5. Admittedly, after the firework that was Season 4, I really did not think any future seasons would be able to top its quality. But I always cared about individual episodes more anyway. Enjoy the video, and once you get to the very end of it, I give an update as far as why I've been so inactive, so yeah, look out for that, alright? Episodes 92 and 93. The Cutie Map. The main 6 investigate a town where all ponies are equal. Ah yes, the season premiere. This one in particular introduces a new artifact called the Map of Friendship. If I recall correctly, I remember hearing that Lauren Faust, you know, the original showrunner, she wanted the main 6 to go at a lot more adventure type stories. Though with how the characters are made, it'd be kinda difficult to do that since they're often kinda bogged down with their own lives. Twilight's a princess, Applejack runs a farm, Rainbow Dash is trying to become a Wonderbolt, Rarity runs her clothing business, Pinkie Pie's a party planner, and Fluttershy handles animal adoptions. So it's cool that this episode basically establishes that the main 6 can go on adventures, but their lives are still kept intact. As for the story itself, there's a lot I like about it. In fact, I'm honestly debating whether or not I like this or Return of Harmony more as far as being season openers. In addition to being really funny, this is a fascinating story in my opinion, where the villain, Starlight Glimmer, effectively started a cult by promoting the idea of making everybody equal, so in effect it's communism. And I just really appreciate this change of pace. It's no grandiose villain, it's no catastrophic calamity, it's mostly establishing how the map works, while also dismantling a dangerous notion about friendship. And one I really agree with. Namely that being different is good, and you should not shy away from showing what makes you special. It's like what Twilight learned in Ghostbusters. This episode also has a lot of really good humor, especially from Pinkie Pie, and it made it really hard to choose the quote to also feature in this video. But if there's anything about this episode I absolutely adore, it's the atmosphere. Just the extremely eerie smiles from all the ponies here. The symbolism with Double Diamond basically acting as Big Brother, and I especially love Starlight Glimmer's role here too. Like, you're probably tired of hearing this, but this episode just does a very good job at showing just how dangerous a cult can really be. Namely where not everyone is truly equal, and in fact, Starlight did have an advantage since she kept her Cutie Mark while everyone else sacrificed theirs. I also really liked how the main 6 are utilized here, especially the ponies given the most focus, i.e. Twilight, Fluttershy, and Pinkie Pie. I love how Pinkie Pie is so in tune with real smiles that she can see right through the phony ones in the town. This episode was also just really good for Fluttershy's character development. Remember in Magic Duel where she was so freaking afraid of Trixie that she wanted to sneak back inside Ponyville, even though it was way more dangerous there than where Twilight was? Yeah, I hated that moment. This episode shows exactly why I love Fluttershy so much. She may be afraid to put herself out there, but she'll act when it counts. But yeah, I liked the story, it had good drama, there was good humor. I do have some nitpicks, but this is a good episode, no doubt about it. Though those nitpicks were mostly in the second half of the special. For example, there's a moment where it looks like Fluttershy was dead in Starlight's freaking vision, and somehow she doesn't see her outside of her window. Also, Fluttershy for some reason whispers to herself, and that doesn't give her away, but gasping almost gets her caught. You know, there's this thing called inner monologue. It's really useful to tell us what you're thinking without actually having to say anything. And after Fluttershy exposed to Starlight, they have the idea to try and break down the door when Fluttershy earlier in the episode escaped through the chimney. Like, there's another way into that house. Why not actually use it? Heck, while Starlight was being pressed by the ponies in her village, why didn't Fluttershy sneak in to get the jars with the cutie marks in them, when at the time there was no resistance? Like, it ultimately doesn't really matter, but these were things I noticed in my second viewing. But all around, this was a great season opener. Episode 94. Castle Sweet Castle. Twilight's friends work on making her castle feel more cozy. The story here is mostly harmless. Twilight's friends recognize that she is not happy with her new castle, and so they try to make the castle one that she wants to spend her time in. Honestly, it's really sweet. There is also a B-plot where Spike is trying to distract Twilight from coming back to the castle, and it's entertaining enough. Like, neither half of the episode feels like it overstates its welcome, so I don't have really any problems with it. But that's not to say I don't have problems with this episode. In fact, I have a lot of them. And a lot of them boil down to basically being that this is a creative difference I have and the episode does not see eye to eye with. The way this episode starts, it feels like Twilight's friends do not know her very well at all. Don't get me wrong, they're clearly aware enough to know that Twilight is in distress, which is a good bit of continuity kept from Lesson 0, because it does show that Twilight's friends are taking her seriously, but the episode's plot is predicated on making Twilight's castle feel like Twilight's castle. So to me at least, I'm kind of surprised at just how caught up the other main 5 got with making the castle feel like their own and not Twilight's. So picture this. I imagine that what they could have done was instead they thought really hard about what Twilight really cares about, like they did at the end of the episode, and made that the focus of the entire 22 minutes. You could have had Rainbow Dash trying to hunt down Daring Do again and trying to get some extra copies of her books because, you know, obviously Twilight's books must have been burned up in the fire of T-Rex, right? Honestly, the additions that Rarity made during the song and, well, the entire episode made perfect sense to me. Heck, one of the things that Pinkie Pie brought up is just how cold and empty the castle felt. So adding all these ornaments and curtains just makes a lot of sense to me. It also kinda ticked me up to know that Rainbow Dash doesn't understand the purpose of a group photo. Maybe Applejack could have focused on the outside of the castle, maybe building a garden around her castle and making it more appealing on the outside. And who could say no to a home sweet home mat? And maybe Pinkie Pie and Fluttershy can focus on adding interior decor and treats, which sounds like there'd be plenty of material to work with. I don't know, maybe I'm missing something, but if I was able to write this episode and I was actually a competent writer, I'd probably go in that direction. And that's not even getting into the fact that for some reason, Rainbow Dash really thinks that Twilight would want trophies with her name engraved on them. Especially since knowing, again, she's a fan of Daring Do. Like, even selfies with Rainbow Dash and Daring Do would make more sense than that. And another complaint I have is that this episode focuses plenty on how Twilight doesn't like her new castle, but it doesn't give a lot of attention to the fact that she's actually homesick. Calling back to Twilight's Kingdom, we saw how angry she got when her home was destroyed. It's not like her emotions of nostalgia came out of nowhere, it's that I feel like they were underutilized for this episode's plot. And not just Twilight, but also Spike's, though the fact that this episode doesn't acknowledge Spike's emotions here at all is a plus. But that's another thing. Those emotions of homesickness, there is actually a lot you can do with that. Like, for example, Applejack suffered from homesickness too, like in the Cutie Map Chronicles. If anything, that would make her design choices in this song make a lot more sense too. Regardless, I'm here to judge the episode for what it is, not what it's not. And for what it's worth, this episode has some fantastic ideas. One thing I really appreciate is the ending, which is honestly a really creative idea from the writers. I really love how the main 5 opted to bring in the remains of the Golden Oak Library and Twilight's Castle, as well as added their own personal touches for each individual room. That is legitimately really creative, and I can honestly say I would not have thought of that. I also really appreciate that the main 5 decided to add their own personal touches to each individual room. So it really feels like each individual one of them really chipped in their own personality. But there's one almost insignificant detail about this episode that pushes it just on the cusp of being okay, right into being good. The characterization. It is excellent. It feels like the main 5 are being fully realized as characters. I love how Pinkie Pie is actually acknowledging before she goes too far that what she's saying is not helpful. I love how Fluttershy is actually willing to stand her ground and defend her animals. I even love Rarity's little remark about Rainbow Dash choosing to bring in some of her own freaking trophies, like Twilight would actually appreciate that. And it overall feels like the previous 4 seasons spent with these characters is actually amounting to something. So yeah, what can I say? I'm happy with this episode. I really am. Though just like It Ain't Easy Being Breezy's, I would only barely call this episode good. So take that how you will. Episode 95, Bloom and Gloom. In her dreams, Apple Bloom explores possible futures after getting her Cutie Mark. Another dream episode. In fact, the 3rd so far in this show. And it's once again focused on the CMC. As for this dream episode, it explores the insecurities resulting from wondering what your future will actually have in store for you. Stuff like, what if your future is something you don't want for yourself? What if it means you have to lose your friends? Or what if your family doesn't accept it? It feels like an episode that covers a lot of bases. There's a lot of really specific things that are addressed, and there's a lot of subtle morals which I really appreciate. Like, for example, maybe you get a job that you don't like, but someone has to do it, and all jobs are beneficial in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes old friends will just grow out, and you just have to accept that you go different ways in your life. There's a lot of good in this episode. Unfortunately, it's not an episode I find very entertaining either. And I think the problem is just that I'm not really in the camp where I was ever worried about my future. But there's another thing, and that's the fact that this episode is actually pretty similar to a previous episode on the show. I'm talking about Magical Mystery Cure. At least for the first dream, it to me feels similar to where Twilight accepts being an alicorn despite worrying if she's even cut out for it. Because it will be good for everyone else that she continues down that road, including herself. It sends a good message on how you should not just blindly turn away from destiny, which helps balance out the overall episode about how you shouldn't just blindly follow your destiny either. Now, there is a place for both episodes in this show, because in that episode, Magical Mystery Cure, Twilight does take the right decision, and we see that that really only ends up being a good thing. In Bloom and Gloom, we do see what happens if you try to turn away from your destiny, and it ends up being worse for everybody involved. So with that said, why do I not like the first dream very much? Well, the similarities aside, I also just do not like how, even like during the middle and the end of the first dream, the animation really isn't all that spectacular. Like, it makes sense for the episode overall because it's supposed to feel real to Apple Bloom. But would it be too much to ask that when Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon appear on screen that more is done with them beyond just the usual teasing that Apple Bloom's already used to? Like, come on, and for whom the Sweetie Belle toils, Rarity was a literal rain cloud raining on Sweetie Belle's parade. Have some fun with these two, you're gonna make them bullies still. Or at the very least, give us an episode about not giving a bully too much power. I still think Family Appreciation Day missed that opportunity. That's just to say, it's getting old. Also, am I alone in thinking that the bit where Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo shared those nightmares also just felt a little tacked on? Like, one moment Scootaloo's drowning and freaking batter, the next moment she's perfectly fine. I honestly expected her and Sweetie Belle to be a little more frazzled. Regardless, the other two dreams felt like they were pretty good. Like exploring what does it really mean to be a Cutie Re-Mark Crusader, as well as what happened with the Derpy Dolphin and her family basically exiling her. You know, in my mind, I know this is a good episode, but in my heart, it's just an okay episode in my opinion. The writer Josh Haber deserves to be very proud of this episode, and I understand this is also a really popular one. But me, I just found it really repetitive, and it's unfortunate, but it can't be helped. Episode 96, Tanks for the Memories. Tank is hibernating, and Rainbow Dash seeks to stop him by any means necessary. Yeah, fun fact, tortoises do hibernate, though contrary to Fluttershy's books, rabbits don't, and squirrels generally don't either. But yeah, this episode has a lot of themes revolving around the pet actually dying. I mean, yeah, there's no one that actually dies in this episode, but the way Rainbow Dash acts, it gives that impression off a lot. And her efforts are fervent in trying to prevent winter so that Tank can't hibernate, even going as far as to effectively vandalize the government-mandated holiday. And I know a few people that do have a problem with this, but me, I personally don't. Rainbow Dash is acting selfishly, but I can see where she's coming from. An important part of this episode, which makes it work in my opinion, is the fact that Rainbow Dash has a motivation beyond something entirely selfish. We've seen before just how much Tank really means to her, so it makes a lot of sense that she doesn't want to say goodbye. And this also manifests itself in the behavior Rainbow Dash demonstrates throughout this entire episode. If you pay attention, she goes through all 5 stages of grief. First is denial, where she denies to listen to anything Fluttershy has to say despite being an animal expert. Next is anger, where even saying the word hibernate or even coming close to saying it will tick her off. There's bargaining, where the episode's plot really comes into effect, where Rainbow Dash is doing whatever she can to try and stop winter from coming. Then there's depression, where she's all forlorn in her house while her friends are trying to cheer her up and she just doesn't want to hear it. And finally, acceptance, where Rainbow Dash finally learns to understand that Tank is going to hibernate and there is nothing she can do to stop it. It really goes to show just how much Rainbow Dash went through in this episode. If I do have any problems with this episode, it would be the fact that Rainbow Dash both does vandalize some equipment in the Weather Factory and gets away with it. I would have appreciated if she came clean and admitted to what she actually did. As is, she got very lucky. And yeah, I know no one actually saw her do it, but it doesn't change the fact that she did not get any comeuppance, and it's ultimately really unsatisfying. And no, the slapstick doesn't count. Though shortly after, we get one of my favorite moments in the entire show, where the main 5 try to comfort Rainbow Dash, but it doesn't work. So what does Fluttershy do? She hits Rainbow Dash with a truth as blunt as a bat. Your winter is going to be petless, and Rainbow Dash just breaks down. She is sobbing uncontrollably, and it is incredible. It's really good to see that Fluttershy really took the lesson from Eat It Easy Being Breezy's to heart, and learned that it has to be sometimes you have to be mean to be kind. It also probably helped that more than Fluttershy also joined there in crying her eyes out. And that's good to see also, friends comforting each other and crying when the other's crying as well. It shows a lot of respect for her emotions. Oh yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the first time in the entire show that Rainbow Dash got to sing a song herself. This episode was overall very bittersweet, but I can say it's also a good episode. Just one more thing though. Do dragons really not hibernate? What about Dragon Shy? 100 years anyone? Episode 97. Appleoosa's Most Wanted. The Cutie Map Crusaders investigate an outlaw in Appleoosa. Yeah, look at that, Appleoosa, a location we haven't seen since Season 1. Well, unless you count Pinkie Pride anyway. A lot of callbacks in the season so far. Except this one focuses on the Cutie Mark Crusaders, who once again are trying to get their cutie marks. Which is really confusing, considering that this episode comes after Bloom and Gloom. Okay, normally I don't want to focus on continuity very much within a single season because episodes can be broadcasted in a random order. But after so many episodes so far where the CMC tried to do different things trying to get their cutie marks, and also learning that they should not be rushing to actually get them, it feels repetitive. Regardless, the reason they're in Appleoosa is because there's a rodeo in town and Applejack is needed to compete there because Brayburn's injured, and it doesn't really add anything to the story, which is really strange. You know, I hear some people say that Brayburn being injured could also be the reason why he fell asleep while watching the CMC, but like, if he's on some pain medications that make him drowsy, they should really bring that up. It would also go a very long way in making him look less irresponsible. Also, according to Applejack, there are rodeos in Ponyville, which we've never heard of before, so why is it being brought up now? As a matter of fact, if rodeos do exist in Ponyville, why not have this episode take place in Ponyville? Why not have both Brayburn and Applejack compete alongside each other? This episode has barely even started and it's already really clunky. I'm not even sure why the CMC are even here to begin with. I get why Apple Bloom is here, but why Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo? Heck, later in the episode where all three are wandering in the forest trying to find Troubleshoes for some reason, Sweetie Belle objects to trying to hunt him down, and yet she goes along with Scootaloo and Apple Bloom anyway. What is it with Sweetie Belle having more common sense for refusing to act on it? Not to mention that yet again, they're disobeying an adult telling them to stay put. So when Applejack and the official zoo catch Troubleshoes, I can't say I'm surprised that she's not listening to the CMC. No joke, I've seen plenty of reviewers call the adults for acting as if they're being idiots here, but they're not. They're actually acting very rationally from what I can tell. They suspect an outlaw abducted some kids, and they find the outlaw with the kids. The CMC try to say that Troubleshoes is no real danger, but they don't actually say anything. Most of their dialogue is just saying, no, stop, don't do that. But nothing more than that, and when we do hear the CMC defending Troubleshoes and Applejack is alone with them, it's revealed there, they never mentioned that they never actually got abducted by Troubleshoes, but they were looking for him. So the CMC let an innocent horse get arrested all because they were afraid of being punished. What a bunch of cowards! Also, on the note of kids going with adults completely unsupervised, someone please teach them about stranger danger. Also, on the note of Troubleshoes, I don't know why, but something about this guy just makes me feel really sad. A lot of the slapstick that happens just isn't funny. I kinda just feel really bad for him more than anything else. His flashback is rather interesting though, because he got his cutie mark when he realized that he was where he wanted to be, in which he wanted to be a rodeo pony. But he got his cutie mark while lassoing, not while making any pony laugh. So like, his cutie mark acknowledges that yes, he does belong in the rodeo. And Troubleshoes also knew that, but he didn't know what part of the rodeo he'd be best at. I guess it's not that unusual, after all, Rarity's cutie mark is about diamonds, and yet she runs a boutique. But at least she got her cutie mark by finding gemstones. Troubleshoes didn't blunder until after he got his cutie mark. This would have made a lot more sense in my opinion if maybe what Troubleshoes had done was that he thought, I guess I'll always just be a laughing stock at the rodeo, or something like that, and then it appeared. It overall just feels very sloppy, and it only really exists to set up a future episode in the same season. But that's for much, much later. Which I guess brings me to one of the few things this episode actually does right. Regarding a future episode, it does give some decent foreshadowing. It's also nice to see them be punished for being disobedient. That being said, Brayburn losing them in the first place, and yet getting absolutely no consequences for that, aside from some really silly slapstick near the end of the episode, is really stupid to me. Especially when he not only insisted on Applejack continuing to practice, despite the fact that she was worried for the CMC's safety to begin with, but also forcing Applejack out of his house before locking her out. I'm just saying, there's more than one stallion here at fault. But nope, no punishment for Brayburn. And before you argue that it was nightfall and Brayburn could have assumed that they would fall asleep at that time too, would it have been too much to ask that he tucked them into bed before he fell asleep himself? Like, for as much as I dislike Stairmaster, Fluttershy at least had that much common sense. That would have went a very long way in removing accountability from him. There's other scenes in this episode that are just really weird overall, like when Troubleshoes is getting jailbroken out, and the CMC tried to distract the sheriff, but only after Sweetie Belle managed to steal the saloon key with her magic. Yeah, this is honestly more of a nitpick, but that scene felt completely pointless, unless the goal was just to show off that Sweetie Belle was learning since Twilight time. So, this episode's foundation sucks. It raised a lot of confusing questions about cutie marks that don't make any sense within the episode itself. The CMC act ridiculous, and the plot before Troubleshoes is really repetitive. Altogether, I'm sorry to say, but Season 5, you've just gotten your first nightmare episode! Hopefully in the future we get more episodes that actually have better explanations for what happens in them. Or maybe the CMC gains some actual individuality. Episode 98. Make new friends, but keep Discord. Discord becomes jealous when Fluttershy invites a new friend to the Grand Galloping Gala. So this is the first episode that focuses on Discord primarily as a character. And for lack of better words, this was a really funny episode. Discord really has not been the most social creature to ever roam Equestria. What with the fact that A, Fluttershy is his only friend, and B, he spent a lot of time in isolation, so I can accept that there are a lot of basic morals that he will just have to learn. Like, of course he's friends with the rest of the main six, but Fluttershy is really close to him. His best friend, if you will. And this leads to Discord making an utter fool of himself at the gala, which is a delight to watch. A lot of what Discord does is just really funny. One of my favorite moments has to do with when Pinkie Pie greets him at Sugar Cube Corner, and the box he's hiding in has an exclamation point appear on top of it. So the writer may be a Metal Gear fan. I respect that. There's also just a lot of really good dry humor too, like to do with Maud and Fluttershy. I love Maud's little quip about Discord being the most basic of jokes, because it's just so freaking true. And Fluttershy just not knowing what to say when Discord asked for her to relay a story about when they went to get 2 cakes from the store was just really funny to me. Treehugger is also a really interesting character, though she may or may not be on some kind of gas if you catch my drift. Honestly, she looks stoned just without the bloodshot eyes. She's also a cool callback to the episode 3's A Crowd back in Season 4, seeing how she and Fluttershy share this fascination with rare creatures. That's really neat. Oh yeah, we also get to see Discord's house for the first time, and it is, it's zany, that's for sure. Not gonna lie, I'm kinda curious how Fluttershy would react if she ever went to visit Discord's house. And then there's the moral where you have to accept that you may have friends that may have friends of their own, but they don't have to be your friends either. It's a good moral, and the jealous Discord have to take that moral to heart as well. But you know, I believe that in time he'll get there. But yeah, I don't really have much else to say about this episode. I don't have much of anything negative to say either. It's funny, it's enjoyable, overall, it's a good episode. Though I can't help but wonder why Discord would ask Spike where Twilight was, and then not proceed to follow up by asking her while she's in Canterlot why he was not invited to the Grand Galloping Gala. Especially because it's stated in this episode that Celestia and Discord are friends. Episode 99. The Lost Treasure of Griffonstone. The map sends Pinkie Pie and Rainbow Dash to Griffonstone to solve a friendship problem. Wow, the first we see the map in action after the season premiere, and in Griffonstone no less, where, surprise surprise, they meet a character from Season 1, Gilda. So since this plot is a lot more adventurous since you're traveling to an entirely different region, this episode has quite a bit of world building as well. We learn a bit about Griffin culture, how they lost their idol, and Griffin society in general. A lot more cold than we're used to in Ponyville, that's for sure. Regarding the characters, I really like Pinkie Pie in this episode. With how cold and dreary Griffonstone really is, it helps a lot with the atmosphere to have Pinkie Pie always trying to liven things up. Without her, this would be a lot more depressing more than anything else. And yeah, she had some genuinely really stupid moments as well, but I don't think it really comes close to just how entertaining she was throughout this episode. She and Rainbow Dash also have by far the most history with her, so you can get a lot more cooler out of those two than any other pony like, say, Fluttershy. Though interestingly enough, Rainbow Dash remarks that Gilda was a jerk especially to Pinkie Pie, though it took Gilda attacking Fluttershy for Pinkie Pie to start acting out, but that never got mentioned. Not to mention, Rainbow Dash never saw that, so I guess it makes sense she would mention that, of course. And on the note of Rainbow Dash, it's clear that she really did not want to be here, and seeing how she interacts with the town also just goes to show exactly how uninviting this place really is. Like, oh no, I fell down a fissure, help me out! Got any money? No? Well, you're on your own. It'd be really bleak if not for the fact that she and Gilda have a history with each other. Speaking of which, I find it interesting how Rainbow Dash tends to befriend bully victims. First Gilda, and later on Fluttershy. And no, it is not lost on me how I'm repeatedly talking about Fluttershy in an episode that never mentions her to begin with. But it's kinda hard not to with the notes I took on this episode. Anyway, the ending is cute. I like the loyalty Gilda displays here. She could have saved the idol, but she saw it more important to save Rainbow Dash and Pinkie Pie instead. The former being her old friend who would stick up for her when she was getting bullied, and the latter who honestly cost you one friend in the first place. Regarding the moral though about how it's better to care about other people instead of just yourself, it's alright. Nothing groundbreaking, but it's at least serviceable. Overall, this was a really cool episode. The map got more action, we got closure on Gilda, it was funny, had some genuinely cute moments, and we learned a fair bit about other creatures in the world. It's a good episode. In general, I'm not the biggest fan of episodes that focus mostly on world building, but this is an exception. Though I kinda hate the fact that we never get to see Griffonstone again. Or Gilda for that matter, they just kinda forgot about her after this. Maybe she appears in flashbacks, but other than that in person, no. And that's honestly a shame. Episode 100, Slice of Life. A day in the life of background ponies ensues when Matilda's wedding plans go awry. Yep, the big 100. And it seems to be spent entirely on the ponies in the background. You actually see the main six in the background of this episode, and it's kind of funny that's actually the case. Not gonna lie, I'm not really sure how to approach this episode because this is entirely unfamiliar territory for me. Of course, I know about Cranky and Matilda already because of our friend Indeed, but after that, there's a lot of characters I really don't know well at all, though as it turns out, this episode seems very heavily inspired by the fandom, which admittedly I never was really a part of. And now you probably know why I don't know what to really say about this episode. Because a lot of context behind a lot of characters, their names, their actions, their occupations, and whatever they do, almost all of it is entirely lost on me. I at least have some idea, mostly thanks to Cinnamare Sins and Little Shy FIM, but since I was never super obsessive over this show, I really don't have much attachment to these characters either. There were some parts I liked though, like for example Gummy being a really deep thinker. Some of the meta humor like Sweetie Belle's quote is also really funny to me. And well, not all the fandom nods are lost on me. I do at least acknowledge the I cooked them up and ate them quote that Lyra had. Mostly because back in the day, I really loved Dan Versus. I imagine for die-hard fans of this show, you'd find this episode hilarious if you are actually familiar with all the memes and the references. But does this episode work even if you didn't have all that background knowledge? Well, I would say yes. The episode's plot is primarily the fact that Matilda and Cranky are getting married, but their invitations that were supposed to be scheduled for tomorrow were actually scheduled for today, and as a result, they had to rush to get it to work out. It's simple, and something I find is impressive also is that M.A. Larson, the writer of this episode, he still managed to write a plenty coherent story, even though the main characters in this episode really don't get to see much action. And I'm not talking about the main six, you're preoccupied with the bugbear, but I care more about Matilda and Cranky as far as when I say main characters. And that's impressive. The message of this episode is also really cool, and that basically everyone has a story to tell, even the background characters. And in a way, it makes me appreciate them a lot more because they get the show a lot more alive than if it was just the main six and Spike. If I had any complaints, I just wish I knew more what was actually going on in this episode, and I otherwise just don't have much of an opinion here, so I'm sorry, but I can only call the episode okay. Even if I did call this episode good, there was no chance of this being a top 5 in my opinion. Episode 101, Princess Spike. Spike uses Twilight's position as a princess to delegate in her place. How did that happen? Well, Princess Cadence needs Spike to watch over Twilight and make sure she gets some sleep. Let me ask you, upon hearing the synopsis, what was your first question to pop into your mind? I'll tell you mine. My first question was asking, where the heck are the sentry ponies that are supposed to watch over the princesses instead? I guess we can assume that the guards were all busy, but even ignoring that, this episode has lots, and I mean lots of problems with it. In fact, I unironically started wondering which episode I thought was actually worse, This or Dragon Quest? Yes, this episode is actually that bad. Early in the episode, we see Spike do a lot of things in Twilight's name to help her get some sleep. Bear in mind, all these actions so far have been entirely selfless, but even ignoring that, there's a very simple solution that Spike completely neglects. If you're worried about loud noises waking Twilight up, get some freaking earplugs! I realized this near the end of the episode, and it makes the entire conflict fall apart. Instead, what Spike does is he goes through all of these hoops to keep Canterlot quiet, moving a polo game somewhere else, preventing a construction pony from actually fixing a leaky pipe. And for some reason, these things called Dragon's Knees trees exist, and Spike prevents the pony from actually cutting them down. Also, before all of that, there's this bird that Spike tries to nicely tell to be quiet, and he goes into Twilight's room and just starts singing to extort Spike to actually do whatever he wants. And on one hand, the bird is a freaking jerk, but on the other hand, why can't you just close the window in the first place? You can very clearly close it, why not try that? If not the freaking earplugs like I mentioned before. But then we get to the main conflict of this episode, where Spike is giving advice to ponies that want to hear what Twilight has to say. And the episode tries to paint this as a bad thing. Which would be an interesting story because A, Spike is a baby dragon, and B, he's not a princess. And maybe he could gain some respect for just how hard Twilight really has it. Though this begs another question. Clearly, Twilight needing to sleep is not confidential. I mean, when he came up to the ponies with the polo game, Spike outright tells him that she needs to sleep. So why does literally nobody else know that Twilight's sleeping? I presume they were all there when Twilight said that she was suffering from sleepless nights and trying to plan everything. At that point, why speak in Twilight's name? Why not Cadence's name? She's the one that assigned you the task. Not to mention she's also a princess. But no, all the ponies just want to hear from Twilight and no one else. And because of this, it unfortunately justifies what Spike's behavior actually is in the episode. But more on this later, and I promise I have lots to say as far as the message in this episode as well. Speaking at least for where we are in the episode now, there is these delegates from Minneapolis and Manehattan that want a ruling from Twilight, and they oddly mentioned that it could cause rift between the Minneapolis ponies and Ponyville despite the fact that this is a Canterlot summit. I don't get that. Twilight's not the princess of Ponyville, she just lives there. And when Spike tells them to share it, they try to talk over each other instead of, I don't know, splitting the time between the two. I get they had only 5 minutes, but like, anyone with common sense would know that if you have only half the time, you shorten it and just focus on what's actually most important to include. Yeah, unlike Appaloosa's Most Wanted, the adults in this episode are actually pretty freaking stupid. And from there, the rest of the episode is mostly Spike pretending to consult Twilight and doing, you know, what Cadence wanted him to do, help keep Twilight asleep. And sometimes he doesn't even do that. When Fancy Pants came around, who you may remember from Sweet and Elite, he doesn't even go inside to try and pretend to talk to Twilight. He just says that's not what Twilight would want, and Fancy Pants just believes it. And again, all of this, mind you, has been entirely for Twilight's benefit. Even if Spike's enjoying it just a little too much, why would Cadence only now consult Spike about his motives? Seriously, Cadence's line would have made a lot more sense if maybe, say, when earlier in the episode where Spike got all those gemstones, he got them using Twilight's influence, like he was actually abusing it. Because at the time where Cadence does ask him, it means absolutely nothing. Heck, what has Cadence been doing this entire episode anyway? Why doesn't she help out? And when Spike does actually abuse Twilight's authority, what does he really do? Get a massage, some jeweled cupcakes, a self-portrait? I mean, yeah, he enjoyed himself a little bit, but it was only after he was asked about it. And it isn't like any of those 4 things had anything to do with what actually caused the flooding in the hall. A random polo ball tips over some Dragon's Knees trees and causes a pipe to burst. Which, yeah, Spike's judgment here was bad, but that's such an extremely improbable situation to actually happen. Like, why even bother with the polo game at all? Just have the pony with a chainsaw try to cut down one of the Dragon's Knees trees and have it be in the direction of the pipe, but have it slowly break over time. Not only would the setup have made a lot more sense, it would be much less contrived that way. And then we get to the actual moral of this episode, where Spike learns it was wrong to use Twilight's princesshood to make himself feel better. I'll give my thoughts on this, but first and foremost, let me just get this out of the way. This is a nightmare episode! So I don't want to say this moral is necessarily bad. The problem though is that this moral feels too similar to Twilight Time, except Twilight Time did this moral much better. In Twilight Time, the motivation for the Cutie Re-Mark Crusaders was entirely selfish, and everything they did was only to make themselves look cooler in front of their peers. Now of course, Spike had to do some things in Twilight's favor, But this episode could have worked if at least before Cadence questioned Spike, he was abusing Twilight's title, but he doesn't. The way this episode is structured, it's as if using someone else's name to make decisions in general is a bad thing, which not only is entirely untrue, but it's also unrealistic. The fact of the matter is that in real life, people really will choose not to listen to you because they don't think you know what you're talking about. So speaking as someone else's name is oftentimes something you have to do. So it really isn't fair to Spike at all to blame him for screwing up when Princess Cadence saddled him with something he can't do all on his own. There's also the matter of how Spike was under a lot of time pressure. A situation where it's not only realistic, but also ideal to think on your feet and quickly provide directions. Though how ironic is that Spike is able to make so many decisions so quickly for so many ponies, all under the guise of Princess Twilight's approval, but he can't think to give her some freaking earplugs. And how much does it really matter that you feel better about using someone else's name if you're doing it for the right reasons? Like, if you engage in philanthropy, it's not selfish to feel good about doing something good for other people. Beyond that, I really don't get the ending at all. Because after Spike takes the blame for everything, all of the other ponies just kind of forgive him, and the moral they end on, the one where everyone's doing their part basically to make something great happen, I just don't get it. What did any of this have to do with what happened before in the episode? Like, even Dragon Quest had a point. This episode has none that I can see. Overall, this episode was stupid, I hated it, and I implore this show going forward to stop bullying poor Spike. Episode 102, Party Pooped. Pinkie Pie is saddled with salvaging a Yak-Yakistan ambassador visit. So you know how Twilight's a princess? Well, it's about time this show really started taking that seriously, because now she organized an ambassador visit with Yak-Yakistan, and she basically wants to bridge both the Yaks and the ponies together, which is an interesting story concept. But this also begs a question. Does Twilight really not know the first thing about how to be a hospitable host towards your guests? Because for most of this episode, it's mainly Twilight and her friends, since Pinkie Pie of course, trying to emulate Yak-Yakistan culture for Yaks. Like, these Yaks are here to experience pony culture, not their own culture but worse. I'm not saying going completely blind to Yak-Yakistan culture, of course you have to know what they don't like to avoid offending them, but that's another thing. At least regarding Twilight, who has read the whole book on the culture of Yak-Yakistan, she really should know better. Because after the first failure, it becomes extremely predictable what happens after that. And that right there is my first and probably biggest complaint. Though to this episode's credit, the way the Yaks respond is pretty appropriate. Though it also made me wonder, why do the ponies want to be allies with the Yaks in the first place? All we ever really hear is the fact that Twilight wants to befriend the Yaks because she wants to surprise Princess Celestia. And then it hit me. Why doesn't Celestia teach you about how to be a good ambassador? Because if this is something that princesses should know, and Twilight is relatively new to this whole princess thing, you'd think the monarch, who has had several ambassador visits in the past, would be an excellent teacher for this scenario. And like, if the goal was to surprise Celestia, it wouldn't have to be like Twilight would consult her beforehand, but I would at least expect Twilight to do some research ahead of time. And barring that, maybe just stick to what you know. This is one of those few times where be yourself is actually applicable. Yeah, rocky start, not good for the episode so far. The rest of the main six really aren't much better either. They can plainly see that trying to emulate Yak culture really isn't working, but they all just keep going along with it. At best, it's cliche, and at worst, it makes them look really freaking dumb. Especially Rainbow Dash. I mean, you actually know how snow is made in the weather factory in Cloudsdale, right? And Pinkie Pie has been there at least once before. So why would you assume that snow is snow no matter where it comes from, despite the fact that you also know that A, Pegasi control the weather and make their own weather, and B, there have been pre-established areas in Equestria where the weather has been said to move on its own, like in the Everfree Forest. And this hurts Pinkie Pie too, because her memory is fantastic. Of all ponies to remember that, I 100% expect her to. Though maybe I shouldn't be too hard on Pinkie Pie this time around. After all, with all the pressure Twilight puts on her, it's hard not to feel bad for her. And this leaves Pinkie Pie to travel all across Equestria to try and understand the Yak-Yakistan culture better. And you know something? If the entire episode was about this, I think I'd like this episode a lot more than I do now. Pinkie Pie traveling all of Equestria sounds like a great idea for an episode. Instead, we got more destruction from the Yaks and more weak gags, as well, get this, Spike playing the piano again, which we haven't seen since Over a Barrel. Except he isn't actually playing it, the piano's playing itself. To be fair though, the first time I saw this I thought it was really funny. but now it's just kind of depressing after Princess Spike. Speaking of depressing, you know that moment where Princess Cadence shows Pinkie Pie the way to Yakistan, and she also mentions how no pony that's ever actually gone there has ever returned? You'd think that knowing that, she'd offer a little bit more extra assistance instead of potentially leaving Pinkie Pie for dead. You know, one of her sister-in-law's best friends. But I guess that's just asking too much of her. But yeah, there's a lot of little things in this episode I really don't like, and one thing about it that I really hate. But this episode is not entirely bad either. The highlight, for example, just has to be the party planning kit that Pinkie Pie has. And quite frankly, it makes you respect Pinkie Pie a lot more as a character, because it really shows just how dedicated she really is to her craft and understanding every pony and what makes them tick. This episode also has a few good messages in it too, namely where Twilight learns how unhealthy it really was for her to put so much pressure on Pinkie Pie to make this ambassador visit something special, as well as the actual message about how to give hospitality, showing what makes your culture unique and good rather than trying to emulate somebody else's. In summation though, I almost want to call this episode okay, because to an extent, I can't excuse the fact that Twilight doesn't quite know how to properly greet ambassadors. Unfortunately for this episode, however, it just does not make up for the utter insanity that Twilight displayed this entire episode in repeatedly trying to emulate Yak culture at a subpar standard, expecting things to change. So for the second time in a row, which is probably a first for this channel, we have our second Nightmare episode! Though if it's any consolation, Pinkie Pie, you're no longer worst pony in my opinion. Episode 103, Amending Fences. Twilight returns to her old friends in Canterlot, seeking to make amends. Oh boy, where do I even start with this one? Let me just throw my cards on the table right now. I love this episode. The idea of basically an entirely different version of Twilight from what we saw in episode 1 of the show, revisiting her old friends in Canterlot, is amazing to me. Because we've seen across multiple episodes just how much she's grown. We've, over the course of the show, seen Twilight transform from this extremely apathetic and quite frankly callous unicorn into the literal princess of friendship. And now she's reunited with her old friends with so much more experience under her belt about how to treat others and be less socially awkward. And it gives a really strong emotional punch seeing her reminisce her past in Canterlot before she left for Ponyville. We see her dusty room back at home. We see the astonishment her friends have when they see her return as a princess of friendship no less. And it is great. But the absolute best part of this episode has to be the new one-off character, Moondancer. Though could you really call her a one-off, because we did technically hear of her in episode 1 of the show. But the conflict centers around her, and I love this girl. Moondancer's personality is essentially, what if Twilight never left for Ponyville and she stayed in Canterlot? And she had abandonment issues. And there's a lot of details that really show how much Moondancer took after Twilight too. They have similar main styles, they have similar interests, and when you get down to it, they have very similar personalities too. Like I said before, Moondancer is basically if Twilight just never left Canterlot. And seeing the stark contrast between Twilight now and what she would have been before if she never left, it is simply fascinating. Just becoming this complete shut-in that doesn't want to associate with anyone. And the scary thing, it's because of how Twilight used to act like Moondancer does now, that Moondancer is the way she is. It's an amazing way to show just how your actions in the past may affect people in the future, even though you may not even realize what you actually did. That's to also say that I really resonated with Moondancer in this episode. Just looking at Twilight's hallucination where she tries to think back to how Moondancer must have felt seeing her be stood up by Twilight, and how because Twilight effectively abandoned her, she didn't want to feel betrayed again. Listen, to go not too much into detail about this, I completely understand how much that must burn. There isn't a much worse feeling in the world than having someone you think was your friend just completely abandon you and treat you like you're basically nothing. And that breakdown near the end of the episode is just, if I had to compare it to anything previous in the show, it'd have to be where Fluttershy was crying after a panic attack in Hurricane Fluttershy. Just the absolute scope of how much emotional impact that moment really had, it can give a man goosebumps. Like, I cannot even begin to emphasize just how sorry I felt for her when I heard her break down after Twilight was trying to throw this party and make it up to her. But that's also not to say that Moondancer was the only good thing about this episode either. I love Twilight here too. Now of course, it was Twilight's guilty conscience that led her back to Canterlot. But I can wholeheartedly believe that she's doing this for her friends, not just herself. And that's very important for this episode to feel genuine as it does. And dare I say it, seeing Twilight trying to get Moondancer to open up it was a lot more enjoyable than Pinkie Pie acting towards Cranky and a Friend Indeed. Probably because I was convinced that Twilight was not being selfish in this episode like Pinkie Pie was in that one. That being said, I'm not entirely against a selfish character, but save that for shows like BoJack Horseman, which as a matter of fact, the episode The Telescope in Season 1, it has a very different take on forgiveness. Still an absolutely fantastic episode though, but that's neither here or there. Though Amending Fences, I have to say, is fantastic. Not only is it a good episode, it's one of the best in the entire show. Though speaking of forgiveness, there's also the moral of this episode. Though technically two. The first one I already mentioned, how your actions can have adverse effects on others and you may not even realize it. The second one though, the moral that Moondancer learns, is that you shouldn't let the actions of a single person completely turn you off from giving something a chance. And the end of the episode is just so heartwarming seeing Moondancer hang out with her old friends in Canterlot. It's a beautiful episode that shows some absolutely glorious growth from Twilight. And after the past two episodes we got, I'm really glad I could call that episode good again. Episode 104. Do Princesses Dream of Magic Sheep? The main six assists Princess Luna in hunting down a nightmare monster. I am not looking forward to this one. Listen, there's a lot to say about the ending of this episode, but let's take it from the top first. From the offset, this episode gives plenty of attention to the Tantabus and Princess Luna, but during one of her dreams, the Tantabus escapes into the main six's dreams as well, and it affects their dreams. And the whole episode is basically Princess Luna trying to hunt the Tantabus down and stop her from giving other ponies nightmares. And if you could not already imagine, yes, this is the fourth dream episode of the show so far. Now, starting with the positives, there's some good humor. I love the joke with how Spike was writing a letter to Princess Luna for Twilight. He was actually including the yawns until Twilight said to leave them out. And I love little moments like that with Spike. It really makes him out to be a really funny character. Also, Big Macintosh in the Dreamscape is an absolute riot. I love how he has this Sailor Moon persona in his dream. And he really runs with the idea of basically using your dream to do whatever you want. There is also some creative dreams from the main six. In particular, Pinkie Pie, Fluttershy, and Rainbow Dash actually have some really cool dreams in my opinion. Pinkie's just reflects how hyper she really is, warping from locale to locale, and seeing how much Fluttershy wants to be pampered by her own pets, it feels like a reflection of how hard she already works to keep her pets healthy and safe. Also, seeing Rainbow Dash having to fight changelings on her own in her dream is honestly really funny because it looks like a nightmare at first, but then you realize, actually no, Rainbow Dash isn't this girly girl pony, she loves to fight. Then the Tantabus does infect her dream, and it is amazing what it comes up with, making basically G3 MLP. And I really wish we had more moments like that from the Tantabus in this episode. Like, you have the ability to fly into these ponies' subconscious and see exactly what their worst fears really are. Like for Twilight's dream, why couldn't we have seen maybe Princess Celestia make a cameo and basically reprimand her for doing whatever she was doing in there? After all, we've already seen her worst nightmare in the Crystal Empire, and maybe you could have a dream where she just dreams her wings are taken away from her. If Celestia made you a princess, she can make you a common unicorn again in your dreams, can't she? Heck, maybe Applejack's dream could have included a reference to some pony to watch over me. We already know Applejack to be very family-oriented, like she could dream about Applebloom or something. I would say dreaming about her parents, but I highly doubt the writer could really do anything about that. And the writer for this episode did write that episode too. But you get the idea. Have the Tantabus do more than just put eyes and a mouth on whatever it's infecting. And speaking of which, the Tantabus did that a lot in the Nightmare of All of Ponyville involved too. Rather disappointing if I'm being completely honest. Also, can I just say, Rarity got ripped off really hard in this episode. Like, the eyes and the mouth thing with her dream especially was jarring to me, because there are plenty of episodes that show exactly what she really hates and it could very easily be exploited. Green hair, being caught in the rain, and though this was a Sweetie Belle dream, maybe her whole business falling apart. There's a ton of material there and none of it was used. Pun entirely unintended. And you know, if the episode was just about the main six dreaming, seeing what their dreams were like, and Princess Luna learning that she didn't need to hunt down the Tantabus all on her own and could actually use some help once in a while, I'd think, yeah, this was a charming enough episode, and I'd call it okay. Though I guess that'd be pretty similar to Applebuck season. But I can't call this an okay episode while also ignoring the elephant in the room. And my god, this was a night. Okay, I caught myself slipping, but you know where this is going. Near the end of the episode, where Princess Luna's guilt is really getting the better of her, she admits that she created the Tantabus to give herself the same nightmare every night, purely to punish herself for the damage she caused to Equestria as Nightmare Moon. In her own words, she did this so that she would never forgive herself. Oh my god, where do I even start with this one? First of all, the conflict itself is resolved way too quickly to feel actually organic. Luna has been torturing herself for well over a year, all to just immediately forgive herself after Twilight says one little thing that made her feel better. Some affirmation that she didn't immediately overcome her guilt and that it be a gradual process will go a very long way in making this feel actually realistic. The most we get is that Twilight gives a 20-second speech, yes I counted, about how because Luna is actively trying to help everyone stop the Tantabus, it shows that she really has changed. And after that 20-second speech, Princess Luna immediately turns coat and forgives herself, ending the entire conflict on a dime. This is honestly worse pacing than what we got from Discord's Reformation and Keep Calm and Flutter On. And it feels like this episode is saying that self-harm is actually an acceptable way of showing that you really learn from your mistakes. I know what the writer was trying to convey with this episode. It's basically saying that you're really not helping yourself by holding onto the past that tightly. Heck, the conflict is actually resolved when Luna forgives herself. But this episode isn't very forward with that moral either. Like, it's never outright said that what Luna is doing to herself is bad. Or especially that what she's doing can have very dire consequences for other ponies. Now you can argue this episode shows it, but the problem with this is that My Little Pony has never really been very subtle with its morals. Normally at least once per episode, it's very vocally stated that this is the moral of the episode. And this is a problem, because Luna's actions here are ridiculously hyperbolic. This isn't physical self-harm, it's psychological self-torture, which is much more difficult to detect in the real world, and even in this episode, Luna's been torturing herself every night for at least over a year with no one being the wiser. Now granted, this is augmented by the fact that the Tantabus tries to escape into the waking world, which likely symbolizes the fact that by hurting yourself so intensely, you also indirectly hurt others as well. Actually, in that context, it makes a lot more sense. But if that's what the writer was going for, then that raises an entirely different problem. Let's evaluate just how much damage she really did as Nightmare Moon. And there are only 2 episodes to really look back on for this. The pilot, Friendship is Magic, and the season 4 opener, Princess Twilight Sparkle. In Friendship is Magic, we can say it was dark for a few hours, maybe some guards were attacked. She threw some trials at the main 6 as well. And oh yeah, for some possibly unknown reason, Princess Celestia was missing throughout most of the episode. And speaking of Princess Celestia, have you ever noticed how this episode is insistent on not bringing her up at all throughout the entire story? Twilight suggests Celestia getting involved, but Luna says that she has no power over the dreamscape, and not once is she ever physically seen. And you know, I wouldn't mind very much, if not for the fact that we also got Princess Twilight Sparkle. In that episode, we saw just how much damage that Princess Luna as Nightmare Moon did to her older sister. She was there when Princess Luna first transformed into Nightmare Moon. She was there when Princess Luna as Nightmare Moon went in a dogfight with her and shot her down into the castle below. And she was there to see the tears in Celestia's eyes as she was forced to banish her sister to save Equestria. Have you ever wondered just how this entire event must have played out for Celestia? How so much of the damage that Nightmare Moon caused was on Celestia specifically? The guilt Celestia must have felt being felt like she was forced to banish her own sister for 1,000 freaking years? But Luna forgiving herself had nothing to do with her older sister at all, apparently. This is the biggest sticking point for Luna's conflict in the episode, and yet she doesn't go to the pony that was actually the most impacted by what she did. Not to mention, at least the main 6 had each other. Celestia was all alone. Honestly, Luna's entire motivation falls apart when you consider the fact that Celestia not being a factor is actually a really big problem when you want to evaluate her motive. Because at least to me, the older sister who you almost killed seems a little too important for this episode to just completely ignore. Listen, I know what the episode was trying to say. I don't like how it said it, especially when Rainbow Dash is like, if the Tantabus is only rampaging because you feel bad about what you did, then just stop feeling bad about it, because psychological issues don't work like that. That's like saying, wait, you can't focus because you have a headache? Stop having a headache. It's not like having your heart beat. You can't just immediately do something just because you need to do it. It's a process. Grab a glass, pour some water in the cup, then you drink it. You don't just stop feeling thirsty. Nor do I like what's actually being said, but I do understand. But riddle me this. Why could the Tantabus not have just manifested from Princess Luna's subconscious guilt? This is an idea I had, but bear with me, because you may not like it very much, but I am just one person, and I thought it'd be interesting to share. What if one day Princess Luna tried to cut herself off from Nightmare Moon? Like she tried to forcibly expel it from her body. That is to say, she never wanted to relive that ever again. But trying to do that, the Nightmare Moon side of her resisted and effectively chose instead to fight for control. And the episode is only really able to be resolved when Princess Luna accepted her past and learned to accept that she's not that person anymore. You could have still done all the dream stuff in this episode because it's still Nightmare Moon, and it being a part of Princess Luna who already has the power to travel through dreams, it writes itself. But at the same time, you'd be able to teach a moral about how you can't run away from your past, but you can't accept that you're not that person anymore. This would also remove a lot of horrifying implications as far as what Princess Luna's dreams or nightmares can do to other people. But not only that, get Celestia involved. Have her fight the Tantabus from the other side when it tries to escape into the real world. Have Luna profusely apologize to Celestia for the damage she did to her. But have Celestia also tell Luna how she forgave Luna a long time ago. Because again, if there's anyone that should have as much impact on Luna's psyche as is now, it's Celestia. Had this episode done that, I'd even call it good. Because honestly, there are some fantastic ideas in this episode. It's like somebody to watch over me. But as is with the execution, I'm gonna say it. The Princess's Dream of Magic sheet may well be the absolute most fitting example of a nightmare episode. Yeah, who'd have thought? I didn't like this episode either. Also, wow, 3 bad episodes in the last 4 episodes I reviewed. That must be a new record. Episode 105, Canterlot Boutique. Rarity opens up her new boutique in Canterlot. The conflict of this episode surrounds Rarity and her boutique, and basically how much say she really has in how it's being run. Because she wants to run it one way, but the manager she has in charge, Sassy Saddles, wants to run it an entirely different way. Now what Sassy Saddles wants to do is focus only on one dress that she knows will be extremely successful. And this should make for an interesting conflict, but, well, something I noticed is that this episode has a real problem with telling us but not really showing us anything. And don't worry, I'm not just talking about the beginning of the episode where we see Twilight talking about how Rarity was even able to afford this boutique. On that note though, it's just really jarring how this episode just kind of tells us straight up how Rarity managed to make this happen, but there's absolutely no build up to it at all. She just has this boutique and it's like bam, the episode happens. But near the end of the episode also, Rarity talks about how every princess dress becomes terrible or common and, well, whatever else she wants to add as adjectives. And while the dresses look more common, absolutely, you don't really see their quality diminishing. There are still plenty of customers that are ordering more princess dresses, and they seem plenty pleased with what they're getting. There are a few dresses later in Rarity's song Rules of Rarity that have some loose fabric or maybe some broken wings, but it's a superficial detail when no one's actually complaining about it. In fact, the first set of dissatisfaction we see is when Rarity tries to experiment with her princess dress and try to give a customer something she did not ask for. And therein lies the biggest problem I have with this episode. And it's that Sassy Saddles, on some length, is actually right. Because oftentimes, you do have to sacrifice making everything unique and being special to make a profit or to stand out. Find out what people come to you for and capitalize on it. There really is nothing wrong with that as long as you keep the quality up. I mean, yeah, Rarity is miserable, but as long as her business is booming and there really aren't any, detractors for her business, then what really is the harm? I think this episode's conflict would be a lot stronger if Rarity was actually facing some negative repercussions from other ponies aside from just her internal struggles. Because at the end of the day, the customer is always right. Or barring that, have Rarity imagine what an assembly line would do to her dresses if she actually let Sassy Saddles have her way. There's a lot of good ideas in this episode, but they're not fleshed out enough. With that all being said though, it's hard not to feel for Rarity in this episode. Listen, as a YouTuber that wants to make all sorts of videos, the emotions that come from wanting to do all sorts of different things, but people only coming to you for one thing is not lost on me. Not only that, but I also understand why Rarity doesn't want to outsource her work to any other ponies either. Because by doing that, it wouldn't really be Rarity's work after all. It would just have her name, but she wouldn't really give it much of an identity anymore. She's also shown some good growth from previous episodes as well, like in, let's say, Rarity Takes Manehattan. The episode where Rarity worked her friends to exhaustion when they were trying to be vacationing in Manehattan. But with everything said and done, I can only call this episode okay. If we had seen more signs of her business actually declining, like let's say there were customers that really were not satisfied with the lack of variety in the dresses, that detail alone may actually get me to call this episode good. Honestly, this is probably the closest to being a good episode so far in the season, but it just didn't quite hit the bar, and that's a shame. Episode 106, Rarity Investigates. Rainbow Dash is accused of a crime, leaving Rarity to clear her name. Aesthetically, I find this episode to be really cool. The scenes where Rarity is stooping around trying to find clues to help Rainbow Dash out, it has this monotone black and white style of color. and it looks really good, as well as the environment and how sometimes it's raining as well. It has a really good atmosphere, which is probably my favorite part of this episode, to be honest. But this leads us into the story, and the story of this episode is rather interesting in some ways, and in most other ways, it, much like Mystery and the Friendship Express, feels like it prioritizes style over substance. And I really don't want to have to say that because I really like this episode on a stylistic level, as well as on a character level. I love how it's actually being shown that Rainbow Dash is becoming more humble since her previous appearances, as well as just how well Rarity really knows Rainbow Dash to know that if she really is excited, to let her have her moments. And that's just it. I love the characters, I love the atmosphere, but what I don't like is the logic and the lack of consistency in this episode's story. The conflict is that Spitfire was sent away to help her mother, who is believed to be ailing, and Rainbow Dash is accused of being the one to sabotage her, because it's later revealed that Spitfire's mother did manage to come to the rehearsal just fine, and is perfectly healthy. Wind Rider accuses Rainbow Dash, and the Wonderbolts immediately believe him and place Rainbow Dash under suspicion. Now, on one hand, after seeing the Ticketmaster, I could to an extent believe that Rainbow Dash would do something as underhanded as that, but that would be unrealistic because at most, that's just a daydream. But the big problem is that Rainbow Dash has on numerous occasions shown that she has more integrity towards the Wonderbolts than some of the Wonderbolts themselves. You're probably immediately thinking about Wonderbolts Academy, where Rainbow Dash demonstrated that she's willing to put her friend's safety before her own dreams of becoming a Wonderbolt. But I'm not calling to that episode, for one reason and one reason only. Only Spitfire noticed that, and Spitfire is the victim in this episode. Ergo, her word has no weight in Rainbow Dash's judgment. That being said, the episode where she wasn't the only one to recognize that was Rainbow Falls. That episode, for all of its shortcomings, did at least demonstrate that Rainbow Dash does have the integrity not to do anything that underhanded, and amongst the ponies to take notice, one of them was Soren, who I know for a fact was in this episode. Listen, I'm not going to say that the Wonderbolts couldn't immediately assume that Rainbow Dash was guilty, but at least one of them should have been taking her side. But then we get to the actual mystery itself. And I have to take a moment right now to make an apology to Mystery and the Friendship Express. Because something I didn't realize on either my first or second viewing of that episode was that Rarity, Rainbow Dash, and Fluttershy did all leave clues behind where they actually ate the cake. Granted, I did know about Fluttershy's silhouette and Rarity's eyelashes, but I didn't know about Rainbow Dash's silhouette when Pinkie Pie was chasing her through the train carts. So if you were really paying attention, you can in fact find those clues out, and there is a very genuine reason to rewatch this episode as well. But I bring this up because I was paying much more close attention to this episode and the details surrounding its animation. And I'm not sure if I should call this an animation error or an oversight on the writer's part. Either way, this creates a plot hole. But Wind Rider's scarf is entirely unchanged from the night before and the day of when he accused Rainbow Dash of actually throwing Spitfire on her wild goose chase. When Rarity discovers the chocolate stain near the end of the episode, she remarks how before it was tied differently, where the day where she found the chocolate stain, it was tied in a Windsor knot. The problem is that when Wind Rider did accuse Rainbow Dash of actually committing the crime, his scarf wasn't tied in a Windsor knot, it was loose and hanging. I mean, you could make the argument that he did have his hooves crossed, so it wasn't hanging that much. But still, Rarity made a point to mention that the scarf was tied in a Windsor knot when the chocolate stain was on it, and previously in the episode, it wasn't tied in a knot. So if the stain was on the scarf, why couldn't we have seen the stain when Wind Rider was accusing Rainbow Dash? This episode also already went through the trouble of setting up that the crime only could have happened that night. Either way you slice it, there should be chocolate on that scarf at that very moment. And this was the moment I realized I couldn't call this a good episode anymore. In fact, by now, I barely could even call the episode okay. And this really hurts to have to bring up. When Rainbow Dash asks Rarity why she didn't tell her what she was doing, and Rarity admits she did not want to get Rainbow Dash's hopes up, Rarity admits that she wasn't really sure, and she wasn't sure until she saw the chocolate stain. You could have said the scarf. Like, if she said the scarf, you could very easily make the argument that she was able to put two and two together, but to say she wasn't sure until she saw the chocolate stain means that she was bluffing. Except there's no good reason to bluff! You pieced together the clues, you collected your evidence, you point out the opponent you thought actually did a crime, and at the end of it all, you weren't even certain that it was him at fault! Despite the fact that this episode has been placing great emphasis on Rarity's attention to detail! What kind of jacked up logic is that? Oh, this hurts my head. But more than anything else, it really hurts my heart. But I gotta do it. It's a nightmare episode. Now, do I hate this episode? Not really. But I wouldn't call it a guilty pleasure either. Like I said before, I love the tone, the atmosphere, the characterization. There is a lot in this episode to love about it. But the mystery, the meat of the episode, it fails. It's actually a real shame that the villain had to have such a flimsy motive for doing what he did. But not as much as it's a shame that we have a new character that was introduced solely to be a one-off villain. Why couldn't this have just been a misunderstanding? My personal recommendation? Take some notes from Turnabout Storm and Elements of Justice, because those mysteries are made with a lot more time-loving couture. Episode 107, Made in Manehattan. The map sends Rarity and Applejack to Manehattan to solve a friendship problem. So this is an episode I ended up liking a lot more when rewatching it compared to my first viewing. It's not the most exciting or the funniest episode, but I found it cute. I actually really like the beginning of this episode where it shows that Twilight is just super bored and she wants to do something special or important. But when the map summons Rarity and Applejack, it's basically saying, nope, not today, you're staying here with me. In my opinion, it's just a really funny way to start the episode off. I also just really like seeing Applejack and Rarity interact in Manehattan, especially knowing how Applejack isn't exactly comfortable in the big city, which you could call a stretch, but I do like to cop out to the Cutie Re-Mark Chronicles whenever I can. Regarding the conflict, remember Coco from back in Rarity Takes Manehattan? She wants to reintroduce a sense of community in the neighborhood. What she wanted to do was try to start the plays off where her mentor Charity Kindheart left off, but the job ended up being too much for only one pony, or in this case, even 3 with Rarity and Applejack. And I really like the resolution and how it's explained in this episode. This is an episode that actually explains why Twilight would have been a bad fit for this job. Because just using your magic and making everything just go completely alright would actually defeat the entire purpose of them visiting Manehattan. And it also really shows you don't need any really grand gestures to give people a good time. A simple pastime to get people to come together and have some fun is all you really need, which I think is honestly a great moral for kids. Though like I said, this is far from the most entertaining episode in the show. In fact, my first time watching this episode, I was legitimately really bored. It was only on rewatch I really started to catch what this episode really had to offer on entertainment. Also, this really wasn't necessary, but I wish we could have seen Babs in this episode too. You know, Appleoosa's cousin. We probably could have gotten to see her Cutie Mark too, but we won't get that opportunity now. It's a shame, but oh well. All in all, I feel very similarly towards this episode like I did the Bloom and Gloom, where I respect the episode a lot more than I actually like it. That being said, I want to call this a good episode, because unlike Bloom and Gloom, I found this episode a lot more enjoyable. Yes, the moral can come off as preachy, and the subtlety is really lacking in this episode's conflict as well. But otherwise, I really don't have any problems with this one. Not to mention, I can definitely get behind the idea of having many hands make the load lighter. Immoral handled much better here than in Princess Spike. This episode also used Applejack beautifully to solve the conflict, and it really demonstrates why she's such a likable character. She's hardworking and level-headed, but also practical. And the day is ultimately saved when she stopped worrying about what they couldn't do and focused on what they could. So while it was nothing fancy that she had to do to solve the conflict, it worked. It's also great to see how a lot of these friendship problems are being solved by using other attributes than what we're used to seeing from the main 6. First was Pinkie Pie's baking, and now Applejack's skills of carpentry. Maybe, just maybe, in the future we'll see Fluttershy's ability with animals coming back in full force. But only time will tell. Episode 108, Brotherhooves Social. Big Macintosh accompanies Applebloom for the Sisterhood Social while Applejack is away. I really like this episode. Big Macintosh is a character I feel just does not get enough development in the show, and there's potentially a lot to unpack. He's the older brother to one of Equestria's heroes, and most of his life is being spent on the farm doing chores and doing whatever he can. And this episode really runs with that information, knowing that Big Macintosh feels he lives in Applejack's shadow. So when the opportunity arrives, when he sees that Applejack won't be around for the Sisterhood Social, and he sees just how absolutely devastated Applebloom is, like any good bigger brother, he does what he can because he wants to see his little sister be happy. Which leads them beautifully to Orchard Blossom. In other words, as Sweetie Belle would put it, Big Mac in a dress. And you know, it would have been way too easy for this episode to just make all the adults really dumb and believe that Big Mac really is a mare. But no, aside from one pony, literally everyone is aware that that's actually Big Mac in a dress. But as the social itself would put it, The Sisterhood Social is a very broad definition of what actually constitutes as a sister, which is actually a rather interesting bit of world building. Oh yeah, speaking of Orchard Blossom, and for future reference, I am using he, him pronouns here because it is Big Mac. I love his personality in this episode. He is really funny and has a lot of really good lines. And he has a lot of really good comebacks, like towards Sweetie Belle and Rainbow Dash. After all, how really are Scootaloo and Rainbow Dash sisters again? And speaking to Sweetie Belle, I love the exchange that she and Big Macintosh have regarding how perceptive she is. And Apple Bloom's absolutely disgusted expression is just golden. But yeah, ultimately throughout the social is a lot of jokes, and a lot of them I find were really funny. And then there's the ending, and I really love the heart-to-heart that Big Mac and Apple Bloom have with each other. Not only because we get to hear Big Mac speak for an elongated period of time again, but we really get to hear what's really on his mind. And alongside it comes Apple Bloom's apology, which I think communicates a really good moral about letting your family know how much you really care about them and how much they mean to you. Just think about that. And I know this didn't have anything to do with funerals, but how often do you hear about these people that have all these wonderful things to say about family and friends when they're already gone? And what really would it cost you to let them know how much you love them and how much they mean to you while they're still around to hear it? We may never actually think to do it because we take it for granted, but it is important to let people know just how much they really matter. There really isn't much else for me to say about this episode. I have some nitpicks, but it's a good episode. So one of my nitpicks is the fact that both Applejack and Rarity are going to Manehattan, which means that both Sweetie Belle and Apple Bloom have no sister to participate with. But is there really a reason why they can't just join up together to participate? Maybe they need an adult to be able to register them both into the competition, but otherwise I'm not really sure about that. And actually that's my only nitpick of this episode. But you get the idea. It's one of my favorites. Episode 109, Crusaders of the Lost Mark. The Cutie Mark Crusaders discover the truth about Diamond Tiara. Another musical episode, and the third one at that, proceeding with Magical Mystery Cure and Pinkie Pride. And for good reason. This episode has a lot to unpack. It's another day for the Cutie Mark Crusaders, as they're once again trying to find out how they can get their cutie marks. And one of their friends from school, Pip, is trying to run for class president. But to win, he has to beat Diamond Tiara in the race for office. A lot of this is communicated through song, and that's actually very important to note because one advantage there is to having episodes with songs in them is that songs can communicate a lot of information in very little time. And through the first act, it's actually shown that Diamond Tiara not only lost the race for office, but she also lost her one and only friend Silver Spoon. Why? Because she's a jerk. A jerk that was taught to be a jerk by her mother, Spoiled Rich. And I just have to say, I adore the design of her nose. Like, everything about her appearance just screams stuck up, but her nose especially. It is so stuck up, you could probably play foosball with it. And in my opinion, it is probably the funniest thing of this episode too. But yeah, this episode also demonstrates that Diamond Tiara got a lot of her bad behavior from how her mother taught her to act. Which, if I'm being brutally honest, this is probably the only really one way that the writer could make this episode work. I mean, the only other option is to make Filthy Rich a villain, and therefore throw a continuity from Family Appreciation Day, which is not a good option at all. And as the CMC see this, I really like the message they try to get across here. Yes, Diamond Tiara has been a horrible person to them since day one, but just because someone treated you badly does not mean you should return the favor. And that is a legitimately really good message. Diamond Tiara also gets some insight into how the CMC lived their lives as friends since meeting each other, and just all the different things they were trying to do to get their cutie marks. And honestly, explaining this all doesn't really do justice. Just hearing the various things that Sweetie Belle is telling Diamond Tiara as far as why they're trying to open up to her more, and the various expressions of guilt and regret for how she acted towards the three just says so much more than I ever could. Now granted, after episodes like Family Appreciation Day or Flight to the Finish, I can't really feel bad for Diamond Tiara, because there is something very wrong with mocking both the disabled and the elderly, but it's hard not to pity her for putting this all into perspective. On the note of Diamond Tiara, it's revealed in this episode that she's been looking at her cutie mark wrong the entire time, which is not only an interesting development, but it's also a parallel between this episode and Appaloosa's Most Wanted, where Chubbuch was at the exact same dilemma. And that's actually a really cool way of foreshadowing too. So with this in mind, I guess it makes a little more sense why the CMC all had to be at Appaloosa that day. Granted, the episode still fails because it didn't make sense for the CMC to be there to begin with, but at least with this in context, it did set up this episode. And I guess that's a good thing because when the CMC do get their cutie marks, yes, spoiler alert there, I would say that most of them got cutie marks that match what they actually are. I can see Applebloom and especially Sweetie Belle, but not quite Scootaloo. And I only really say not quite because her cutie mark has both a feather and a lightning bolt in it to symbolize both her speed and of course ability as a Pegasus. But there's more evidence for both Sweetie Belle and Applebloom. Sweetie Belle has always made it a habit to try and separate herself from Rarity and become her own pony. And Applebloom's end goal has always just been to get a cutie mark, and now she has it. But her mark also has an apple with a heart in it, a way of saying she's an apple to the core. Yeah, you can dislike the video now. But while you do that, I don't dislike this episode. In fact, I think it's a good one. But you're probably wondering one thing. Why do I like this episode, but not do Princess's Dream of Magic Sheep? Because some of you imagine that Diamond Tiara's reformation here was actually rather forced. To which I would say, I don't really agree with that. And I'll explain why. The first reason is because I don't think that Diamond Tiara's resolution was too quick. And this is a big reason why the songs are so important. We get a lot more insight on Diamond Tiara when she talks about how because she was raised to be a certain way, she really doesn't know any better. In fact, there's at least 2 songs dedicated to that, The Pony I Wanna Be and Light Up Your Cutie Mark. The former tells about how Diamond Tiara wants to be a better pony but she doesn't know how. And the latter has her vent her shame for not being able to live up to her parents, with the CMC pleading that they can help her. So this is given a lot more time to be truly fleshed out. Another factor is that the CMC are in fact the ideal ponies for the job. No matter what you have to say about the Princess's Dream of Magic Sheep, you have to acknowledge the fact that no Princess Celestia is actually a really big issue when it comes to Luna's motivation. Because the pony that Luna tried to commit regicide against should have a lot more sway than this episode is leading on. But Diamond Tiara has seen firsthand just how much the CMC got to grow together. Not to mention that she put them through so much opposition already, so if anyone knows how to make a good situation out of a bad one, it'd be them. The songs in this episode also do a lot better at a job at making you feel the emotions that you really should, unlike Magical Mystery Cure. Though this is ultimately because the episode has much better pacing associated with it. So when the episode wants to get melancholy, you can actually feel bad for the characters involved. And when the music gets intense, you can feel the intensity too. Now, not all the songs are great, but I do think that there are some really decent tunes here. Which is nice, because if the music wasn't great, well, then this episode in general would suffer a lot more. But it doesn't have to, and that's awesome. And what we got was a grand celebration for the CMC, how far they came, and a hearty congratulations for finally conquering their biggest adversary, Diamond Tiara. What more could you ask for? Episode 110, the one where Pinkie Pie knows. Pinkie Pie is burdened with a secret she has to keep from her friends. This episode doubles as a test of Pinkie Pie's ability to actually maintain her promises, even though it's not a Pinkie promise, so there really was no guarantee she'd be able to do it, as well as a way of introducing the fact that there'll be a new baby character to the show in the upcoming season, which can only go so well because babies don't really tend to make shows much better when they are introduced. If anything, they only make the show worse. But that's season 6's problem, this is season 5. Anyway, this episode as far as story really isn't very special. For all the runtime, Pinkie Pie is trying to keep a secret about Shining Armor and Princess Cadance having a baby together. How much you enjoy this episode will largely depend on how funny you think Pinkie Pie is. If you find her funny, it's easily a good episode. If not, it's at least an okay one. Because there really isn't anything wrong with this episode, if I'm being honest. There is some really stupid dialogue, particularly when Pinkie Pie recounts the pinky promise she made to Mr. Cake, as well as when she's talking to her reflection in the window, but beyond those 2 moments, the dialogue is honestly fine. In fact, I'd argue there's some really funny jokes in the dialogue as well. Though my favorites tend to come from when Pinkie Pie is really impatient and antsy to get the secret out. Like when Pinkie Pie is actively annoyed hearing Twilight recount her love for books. That's actually really funny. Though a lot of the humor also just did not do it for me. Like, a lot of jokes in this episode come from funny faces. If you find it funny, great. If not, it's probably not gonna do it for you. Consider it on the upper side of okay, because I just really don't have much to gush over here. I'm much more drawn to episodes that focus more on story and heart, and humor really isn't gonna give me much to really come back for. Heck, I don't even know if this episode had a moral associated with it. But I'd rather take no moral than a bad moral anyway. Episode 111, Hearthbreakers. The Apple family bids the Pie family to spend hearths farming together. Once again, an episode that focuses on Pinkie Pie and Applejack. I found this to be a cute story, seeing the Apples experience culture shock with the Pie family. Just seeing Applejack and Pinkie Pie so excited to get to spend hearthswarming together, and then seeing how Applejack bounces off the Pie family and how they actually do hearthswarming together. I find this to be a rather interesting character study in Applejack in particular. Throughout the show, she's shown herself to be very traditionalist, though that attitude seems to be waning after certain episodes. This episode has to be traditionalist, but only for the traditions that she already knows, not the Pie family's traditions. It's kind of surprising actually. I have expected Appleblom to be more willing to compromise the traditions of the other side, but I'm happy to see that this episode didn't try that route and showed her actually being rather respectful of the Pies, and it's instead Applejack who tried to force her traditions to be acknowledged instead. With the focus on presence later in the episode, I could have seen her going that route, but it's a welcome surprise for sure. And yet, she also still acts plenty like a kid too, like getting excited after seeing Applejack change the whole rock farm because of the presents that were just laid out, and Granny Smith having to bring her back down to earth. I really like little character interactions like that. I also expected Limestone Pie to contribute a lot more mischief towards the Apples, since she's shown to be pretty hostile, but even despite sometimes coming off a bit sadistic, she's not trying to sour the mood for anyone. You know, I'm just glad to see that these ponies are trying to get along. And this alone would at least get me to call the episode okay at worst, because I think the story is actually pretty well put together. Granted, there's a few things about this episode I don't really understand. Like, how would looking for a real rock be weird when literally everything you've done prior involved real rocks? Though sadly, it is in character for Pinkie Pie to not really consider how the other side feels. She just kind of assumes that her logic is what's commonly accepted. It's a shame, but I'll give the writer credit. At least he managed to get that detail accurately. If I had any real complaints still about this episode, it's that I think that Applejack really lost the plot when she tried to force her traditions on the Pie family. Now, I never celebrate holidays. Heck, I don't even celebrate my own birthday. But like, isn't the whole point of Christmas spending time with your family, and less so what you can actually get out of it? I really wish that was brought up at least once. Like, I guess traditions are fine and all, but I think it'd be a lot more important to just recognize the people you're spending your time with instead. Especially since Applejack is already a very family-oriented pony. That being said, I'm not gonna dock this episode that much enough where it can't be called a good episode, because I can't understand where Applejack is coming from. She is still thinking about family, just from a very materialistic angle. And the moral she learns is also still pretty good. It comes down to giving respect first before asking for respect. In trying to change the Pie family's traditions, she was not showing respect to them. But coming to understand them better, before showing what she actually does back at home with her family is a much healthier way of going about it. So yeah, I like this episode. Episode 112, Scare Master. Fluttershy attempts to branch out and spend Nightmare Night with her friends. Now, of all episodes so far reviewed, this one is by far my favorite fun fact. Did you know that this episode was actually accidentally released 1 month earlier, when the Cutie Mark Crusaders got their cutie marks already? If not for the fact that the CMC were in costumes, this would have spoiled literally every fan at the time of what their cutie marks would have been. It's a really funny blooper that could have been a really bad blunder, but we're really glad to see that it didn't really come to that. Anyway, remember Fluttershy and her appearance in Luna Eclipse, where she wanted absolutely nothing to do with Nightmare Night? Well, she's decided to give it a chance in this episode. And I don't know why, but I find it to be absolutely hilarious. At least more often than not, I find it hilarious. My favorite part just has to be Fluttershy's spooky tea party and seeing her try and fail to be scary to her friends. It's so cringy but also so adorable, and it does a great job of setting up the idea in her friends' minds that Fluttershy really cannot pull off being scary well at all. If you couldn't already tell, I really enjoyed this episode. By no means is it perfect, but no episode really is. But that's not to say that I don't have some issues with it. For starters, I can appreciate the fact that Fluttershy does want to try and branch out and give something that she doesn't normally like a chance, but Fluttershy never really did give Nightmare Night much of a chance anyway. I'm not really bothered too much by this though, because it is pretty well demonstrated in previous episodes that Fluttershy has very bad anxiety, and the thing about anxiety is that it tends to make people act irrationally. Not only act, but also think irrationally. What I'm saying is that there's no good reason for Fluttershy, a Pegasus, to worry about tripping. At least unless you want to go all the way back to Season 1 Fluttershy, where her wings will lock up at the sight of a dragon roaring nearby her. I mean, you could argue that Rarity, a seamstress, should be able to fix her dress up so you wouldn't have to worry about tripping by making it maybe shorter, but I imagine that hemming up a dress would take more than a few minutes to do. And Nightmare Night only really lasts for a few more hours. Really, the only problem I have with this episode is the fact that Fluttershy is actually terrified of the candy that Pinkie Pie has laid out for everyone, and this bothers me for two reasons. Reason number one, Pinkie Pie knows Fluttershy way too well to try and prank her. If she knows something as minute as that Twilight is afraid of quesadillas, then there's no doubt in my mind that she knows that Fluttershy hates pranks. Heck, she outright says it in Griffon the Brush Off. So what I wish this episode did was at least have Pinkie Pie try to reason with Fluttershy, even though it wouldn't work, just to cover that base, because Pinkie Pie can legitimately have a good argument that she would never try something like that in Fluttershy. And reason number two was because of Rainbow Dash. Okay, bear with me. Throughout this episode, Rainbow Dash has been constantly very annoyed seeing Fluttershy always having her anxiety take hold. And oftentimes, she's judged by her own friends because, of course, they don't want to be rude towards Fluttershy. But this is one time where she really should have stepped in and tried to say something. Honestly, I'm disappointed by the fact that she didn't. But beyond all of that, I would say this is a good episode. And that's also because I really like the moral of it. There will always be more chances for you to hang out with your pals, but you don't have to always do everything together. Especially that if you don't want to. Besides, I'd argue that Fluttershy's friends really cannot do much to really help her anxiety anyway. Remember, she's no stranger to phobias at all, so it's doubtful that they'd have much success with reassuring her that she isn't in any real danger. Either she has to be motivated to act out of her own want like in Hurricane Fluttershy, or she has to accept being the only way out of a dire situation like the Cutie Map. And both of those are also arguably her duty to see through. Nightmare Night is supposed to be recreational. Besides, if you're hanging out with friends doing something you staunchly hate, you'd likely be more of a burden than anything else. And friends that can't respect that are pretty freaking scummy. So I really don't have any problems with this episode. It was thoroughly enjoyable from start to finish. Episode 113. What about Discord? A staycation results in Twilight missing out on an inside joke between her friends in Discord. So did you ever want to hear an inside joke be repeated over and over and over throughout 22 minutes and never actually understand it? If you did, you're in luck because this episode exists. And it's episodes like this that make me really think that I just do not get this show sometimes. Before I call this a nightmare episode, because let's be real here, you already know it's a nightmare episode, let's talk about the story. Twilight and Spike spend the entire weekend inside their castle, basically to sort books for 3 days. Something that ends up being entirely pointless. And the rest of this episode is just Discord and Twilight's friends repeatedly making this joke about Sweet Appleoosa and what happened while they were there, over and over and over. I'd be bored if I wasn't so absolutely annoyed throughout the entire thing. Like, the point is that we're supposed to feel left out like Twilight was since she missed the entire thing? And I guess I'll give the writer credit for that, because I definitely felt left out and confused the entire time. But that's not a good thing. At all. Heck, throughout this episode, I was just wondering, can't Discord make flashbacks like in Return of Harmony Part 2? I guess it doesn't really matter that much because, as Discord and his friends would say, they've been pretty exhaustive trying to explain Twilight what she missed out on. But it wasn't even like that this entire montage was funny, it was just kind of tedious. Yeah, that's my biggest problem with this episode. It was boring. I'm not gonna claim that Twilight should go all less than 0 or it's about time in this episode because that would show character derailment. In fact, that's something about this episode I can actually appreciate. Twilight actually ends up being pretty composed throughout the entire thing, but all the goading and trying to make her feel like she really missed out on something that she'll never be able to experience with her friends, it's just painful to keep looking at. This isn't the kind of feeling you want your audience to feel. If this was from Discord's perspective, and we got to actually see what was going on with him in the main 5, I think this would be a lot more interesting. Because clearly there's something that's supposed to be really funny here, but we don't actually get to see it. In fact, I really wish the writer did go in that direction, because from Twilight's perspective, it's just miserable. And as if it wasn't bad enough that Twilight feels like garbage throughout the entire thing, which makes the audience feel like garbage as well while we're watching it, she starts hypothesizing that Discord put her friends under some kind of spell, and they don't really enjoy being with Discord either. She up and says to Sakura that she believes her friends are under a spell because they're actually having fun with Discord. which is not only just criminal character development for Twilight, like she up and called Discord one of her real friends when he betrayed them back in season 4's finale, but it just makes me feel really bad for Discord that Twilight could really think of him to do something like this. Heck, there was an entire episode where he had to fake being sick just so that she would pay attention to him. Stop pushing Discord away. Like, why couldn't you have just imagined it's because your friends acted a little bit differently than they normally do? Heck, there's a moment in the episode where Fluttershy straight up cuts Twilight off mid-sentence. You would never expect her to do something like that. If Twilight believing her friends were under a spell was a result of her observing entirely inconsequential events to happen throughout the episode, and it was just her OCD taking control, that'd be a much better way to go about it, even if it did run the risk of having Twilight look irrational. But accusing someone of being manipulative just makes you look petty at best, and at worst, for lack of a better word, way worse than someone who's simply jealous over missing out. So yeah, it's a nightmare episode. Honestly, what did you expect? But there is one thing about this episode I will defend. So you could argue that Twilight's friends should know Twilight better, but the entire point of this episode was Twilight needing to learn to come to terms with her own emotions, and her friends apologized for rubbing the frown they had in her face. Twilight's distress was obvious to us, the audience, because we both have Spike to communicate that she's hiding something, and we spend more time from Twilight's perspective. What I'm trying to say is that Discord calling out the main five for being oblivious would only make him look worse for not saying anything at all. He spent the most time with Twilight, meeting her at every juncture when the rest of her friends weren't even all together, and as Twilight tried to put it, it was about the good of Equestria, not her own feelings. So to assume otherwise would make them look like they were trying to project onto her, not being sensitive to her feelings. But still, I can't really blame people for thinking this. Just wow, this episode was messy. Episode 114, The Hoofields and the McColts. The map sends Twilight and Fluttershy to put an end to a feud between two neighboring families. So from what I understand, the Hoofields and the McColts is actually inspired from a real-life feud, the Hatfields and the McCoys. I can't tell you much about it because I don't really care for history, but it's an interesting fun fact to put in. Anyways, these two neighboring families hate each other, and neither one really knew why. Off of that alone, I was expecting this episode to go the route of teaching a moral about letting go of resentment, especially when you don't even know what you're fighting for, instead of the moral they really went for, which is just saying that friendship is more important than winning an argument. A moral which I don't think really works for this episode when these ponies were never friends to begin with. Honestly, given the circumstances in this episode, I expected a lot more propaganda, like both the Hoofields and the McColts hearing stories about the other side from their elders, and building up more and more animosity within the feud. And if that sounds weird to you, I kind of agree with that, but A, this show has tackled much harsher subjects, and B, spreading lies about others is not even outside the scope of the show. It just seems like a lot more could have been done with this episode's premise rather than just senseless fighting over nothing, especially when Fluttershy is actually able to define the real reason why the feud ever started. But the episode otherwise is entertaining enough. Something I found interesting was that you can see both Twilight and Fluttershy carrying bags that look like they weigh about the same, but Twilight has no issue carrying the bags while Fluttershy can actually feel her bones breaking under their weight. This to me communicates that Alicorn ponies actually have Earth pony magic, which would explain why Twilight is so strong, but Fluttershy being just a Pegasus means that she doesn't have that same amount of strength. That's a cool detail. Otherwise, I really enjoyed Big Daddy McColt in this episode. The way he says, Hoofields, is actually pretty funny to me. And there are some pretty fun gags also, like seeing his shout drop the Hoofields shelter. So yeah, I found this episode decently entertaining, but I have to say, Twilight was by far the weakest part of it. Like, not only is her wording sometimes really bad, and sometimes even come off as preachy, like telling both parties that they're wasting time and resources being mean to each other, but it really feels like she cares more about the result than actually seeing the problem get resolved. Like when she suggests to the Hoofields to just apologize, despite not even knowing what they did wrong. It feels like you're trying to teach them to basically be disingenuous. In fact, I wish that Ma Hoofield did ask her what for. Though to the writer's credit, the way they went about this was actually a lot funnier too. Ma Hoofield actually had the idea to get a Trojan cake, hide some of her kin in that cake, and infiltrate the McColts fort from inside. That's actually pretty clever. And her response to Twilight is also just really good, because Twilight's suggestion really could never have worked. Which, to this episode's credit, is probably why Fluttershy is such a good fit here, because at least she cares for the animals that are either in danger or starving. Which, speaking of which, one of those animals is a ferret, and ferrets are carnivores. How is a ferret starving when it's literally surrounded by its prey? Heck, how are the animals starving if there's so much food lying around, and some animals are actually desperate enough to eat off the floor? It's not really a plot hole, so much as I just think that if you're really hungry, you tend to go into survival mode and eat whatever you can get. But that's not going to keep me from calling this a good episode. No, what is stopping me though is the moral, which I said before. If it was better tailored to the actual conflict in this episode, I'd call it good, but as is, consider it on the upper side of okay. Yeah, I'm reluctant to say this, but I think this is actually the weakest of the map episodes in Season 5. It's not far behind the Lost Treasure of Griffonstone, but that to me just says how close this episode was to being good in my opinion. Episode 115, The Main Attraction. An old friend of Applejack's arrives in Ponyville, but isn't exactly herself. Man, this episode makes me really sad. Not for the actual episode itself, but because the writer of this episode, Amy Keating-Rogers, is the last of the original writers for the show, and this was her final episode, aside from like Fame and Misfortune with Anne Larson, but knowing the production behind that, I don't want to count it. So the story here is that one of Applejack's longest withstanding friends, Rara, or Coloratura, became a pop star, and the way she acts now is no longer what Applejack remembers. Mostly because of her manager telling her to put on this facade and having her be presented as such. And the way this episode ends is where Applejack and Rara are friends again, with Rara now acting as how she was remembered to be when they were first friends. So as far as any immediate observations I've made, this is an episode I would say Canterlot Boutique wanted to try and be, but couldn't really pull off. I say this because, to an extent, both episodes focus on business, but in Canterlot Boutique, that episode focused a lot more on what Rarity wanted for her store, ignoring the fact that if you really only focus on what you want, you both ignore what makes your store so popular, and you also run the risk of actually alienating your audience. It also would mean ignoring the fact that Sassy Saddles actually had a convincing argument for how she was running Rarity's boutique. The main attraction, meanwhile, focuses a lot more on the relationship between Rara and Applejack, and Rara being that pony that Applejack actually remembers. This also ties into the moral, which is basically saying that your real friends want to see you for being who you actually are, not what, let's say, society wants you to be, or in this case, Sven Gallop. And it's important to also recognize that the pony that Rara really is deep down is absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. She's charitable, she's honest. She actually has a natural talent for singing, so she doesn't really need auto-tune to really be performing well. And this point manifests beautifully in the ending song of this episode. But being brutally honest, I loved both songs in this episode, especially the first one, which was the rehearsal. Whatever that dubstep pop was, it was absolutely hilarious, and I loved every bit of it. All the same though, I am very impressed by this episode. With how much people really hate the be yourself moral, it's extremely impressive that this episode was able to deliver that moral so well. Yeah, it's a good episode, and I really don't have anything negative to say about it. I mean, yeah, Pinkie gets treated like dirt, but A, that's to actually further the plot, and B, I'd be remiss if I didn't admit that I actually enjoyed it. And otherwise, I just thought this episode was really pretty. Notably near the end where you see all these lights and the unicorns are lighting up the stage using their horns as lighters. The flares from Robert's Cutie Mark, the night sky, it's all just really pretty on the eyes. And that all said, I think this is a real contender for a top 5 episode in the season. Episodes 116 and 117, The Cutie Re-Mark. Starlight Glimmer returns to exact vengeance on Twilight and her friendships through time travel. Well, this'll be fun. Yep, the insane cultist is back for round 2, and it leads to quite possibly the wildest episode of the show so far. This episode raises a lot of questions, and there really aren't very many answers that it gives either. There are plenty of theories to answer all the questions that were raised here, but those theories only create more questions. But let's take it from the top. Like the bit that starts this episode up where Starlight throws the scroll away, I guess debate Twilight and Spike to actually touching it and pulling them back to the past. Later, Starlight explains that she left the scroll behind specifically to do this, but why? If the whole point of this spell was to irreversibly destroy the future that Twilight had set up for herself with her friends, why leave the scroll with Twilight? Had she kept it on her, there would be absolutely no chance that Twilight could have caught up to her and stopped her. Besides, it's not like the wormhole just sucked Starlight in when she tried to fly through it. She had to use her magic to fly into the wormhole, though the spell should work on both Starlight and Twilight. But then, why did Spike get pulled in? Like, the wormhole never pulled the map when Starlight flew into it, so why did Spike get flown in there too? This is especially bizarre because even though Spike isn't really only here to be rescued, it still feels like he's underutilized in this episode. It's no question that oftentimes Spike has more common sense than Twilight does, but around halfway through the special, he feels redundant. Like when Twilight's talking to Rainbow Dash as a filly because she wants her to do the Sonic Rainbow, and Twilight talks about how she saw Rainbow Dash do it in the future and it scares Rainbow Dash off. Okay, ignoring the fact that you can do the Rainbow yourself, do you not know Rainbow Dash well enough to know how to motivate her? Like, this would have led to a different future anyway, because it wasn't like Fluttershy was being bullied anymore. The writer did not have to make Twilight so stupid here. And speaking of the future, every future, because of these slight differences, seems to be entirely different. Except, not really. They're always terrible. This point doesn't really matter very much, but don't any of these villains want a good future for once? Why are they always horrible? I don't get it. But back to being serious for a moment. Why is Nightmare Moon not the one to win in every single future? It was established as early as Friendship is Magic Part 1 that the only way to really beat Nightmare Moon was the elements of harmony. And it showed in Princess Twilight Sparkle exactly how Celestia was able to actually do it. To say nothing of the fact that without the elements of harmony, Luna would have committed regicide, right on her own sister. If there's no elements, how did Nightmare Moon lose? Or barring that, why is Nightmare Moon never shown to be feuding with King Sombra? The vague suggestion that Starlight is still in the past doesn't tell us enough. And if Twilight's friends aren't friends anymore, then who are the new element bearers? We see all these dire and dreary futures that were ruled solely by antagonists, and not one did we ever see any ray of hope? I don't know about you all, but I can't afford to pay for a bridge like that. And there had to be at least some element bearers, because one of the futures we see, at least in the quick montage of futures, was where Discord was released from his stone, and he was goofing up with Celestia and Luna. So how did Nightmare Moon become Princess Luna again without element bearers? Why do we never get to see them? It's such a simple solution too. Just have one of the futures not be absolutely horrible. Show us the new main six. Like, they can be anybody as long as they're at least tangentially related to each other. Maybe you wouldn't feel exactly right, but they can still work with it. It feels like there's just so much wasted potential with this episode. Like, the fact that this episode uses time travel isn't really my problem. No, the only real problem here is that they have so much going on, and they don't really properly explain it enough. But it's all rallying behind the point that Twilight and her friends are important. Which isn't exactly wrong, but this episode also wants to really aggrandize that point. And yet almost nobody in this episode can recognize the fact that Twilight's a princess. Seriously, Applejack doesn't recognize it, Zecora doesn't recognize it, not even Rarity recognizes it. She's been called Twilight a tourist, not recognizing the fact that she has wings and a horn too. I get that Nightmare Moon's in control, but not even a passing glance? And amidst all these bad futures, somehow Starlight is entirely oblivious to it all until Twilight brings her into the future to see what she was causing. So how is it that she's able to immediately recognize Twilight returning to the past and even gauge what Twilight is ready to do and think to do something entirely different, but not have it registered that the future actually holds something different? Like, does she only remember seeing Twilight teleported into the future and then it's just immediate that she sees Twilight return? So she's subjecting herself to relive Groundhog Day then. But like I said before, she wouldn't have to go through all of that if she never opened the way for Twilight to interfere. This episode just loves to make Starlight look like a really dumb villain, doesn't it? And then we get to her backstory, and the motivation that she has for why she's doing what she's doing. And it boils down to the fact that she stayed at her village and never made another friend because she was afraid that another Cutie Mark would take them away. She never tried to visit him in Canterlot, maybe ask your parents, write him a letter, tell literally anyone else. Well, to be fair, it does give a lot of credit to the moral, not letting change ruin friendships, and working through what makes you different is a good lesson, I have to admit that. Granted, I've heard of better motivations that would lead villains to go off the deep end, but okay, let's just see exactly what would have happened if Appleoosa was a freaking unicorn. And heck, not even Trixie or freaking Moondancer pulled stuff like that, and they had better motivations than her. Yes, I said Moondancer. I know she's not even a villain, but that just goes to show how extremely petty this actually is. Do you know what this needed? This backstory needed to show Starlight in a more sympathetic light for me to actually care. Like, let's say she tried to reach out to her friend, but she experienced a side of society that dropped the seed into her mind that cutie marks were the problem, whether from locals in Canterlot, which would also be reinforced by Spoiled Rich in Crusaders of the Lost Mark with her dialogue there, or even her own parents. At least something that would make it reasonable to conclude that this would be the only choice forward for her. Because this does not make me like Starlight. This actually makes me really resent her. If losing one of your friends to a cutie mark is all it took for you to start up a whole freaking cult, you don't need friends. You need a therapist. And yet, she's not gonna get any therapy. Not for a very long while. And she's the new main character. I'll be honest, with this, I'm not looking forward to Season 6. Actually, do you know what would be a really good moral for this episode? If instead of just saying why Twilight's friends are so important, or what Twilight did to stop Starlight from destroying the future, maybe this episode could have focused more on Starlight's one line where she says that Sunburst moved on but she didn't. And maybe out of desperation, she tried to go back in time to stop Sunburst from moving away, because of just how afraid she was of losing her friend. But in doing that, it would lead to Equestria being consumed by complete bedlam. We could have gotten a very important moral about how important it is to keep moving forward and leaving the past in the past, because what we endured back then shaped us into what we are now, which also would have tied in much better with the actual events of the episode. Like remembering back to how Spike had to actually stop Twilight from trying to rescue Fluttershy when she fell shortly after Rainbow Dash's race began. That would have been brilliant! This episode was awkward, but it also takes itself so ridiculously seriously it's not even funny. And this episode was so all over the place, it left me completely confused. Even some of the dialogue was just really hokey. Like the beginning where we're given that exposition dump from Twilight and Spike tries to be so ominous about Starlight being back for revenge. I get that the main demographic here is for young children, but I just feel that last bit was a little unnecessary. All in all, if you care about world building and fanon, this would probably be your wet dream. But for me, nah, Chief. It's a nightmare episode. For all its faults, though, I do like one thing about it. The fact that Twilight knows you shouldn't really let Starlight roam free. So she'll have a very close eye on her for Season 6 and onward. And yeah, this makes a lot of sense for Twilight's development as a character. Because now she really is following in Celestia's hoofprints. Your own friendship student. You'll love to see him grow up so fast. But man, am I not looking forward to it. Maybe Starlight will surprise me when we get to see more of her, but right now, I don't like her. And I hope you can see why that is too. And that is every episode of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic Season 5 reviewed. So how'd the season do overall? Well, there were 12 good episodes, 5 okay episodes, and 7 nightmare episodes. Ugh, that's a lot. But on the bright side, about half the season was good still. And at least one of those good episodes was a two-parter, so I don't know, do I call it a good season or an okay season? To figure this out, I think we have to compare Season 5 to Season 1's results. Because Season 1 was just barely not a good season because of the fact that the good episodes had no two-parters included. And since there were 25 episodes total, it was just under half. Season 5 meanwhile is exactly cut in half as far as good episodes and not. One thing's for sure though, this was a season of extremes. You have Amending Fences and Crusaders of the Lost Mark, which are just fantastic episodes all around. But on the other hand, you have What About Discord and Princess Spike, which are some of the worst episodes in the entire show. Actually, let's think about this from a different perspective. What about the okay episodes of Season 5? Well, most of them were really close to being good episodes. As for the worst okay episodes, however, in my opinion, Canterlot Boutique and the Hoofields and the McColts, I do consider them to be objectively flawed. But the other okay episodes, i.e. Bloom and Gloom, the one where Pinkie Pie nodes and Slice of Life, I can see these being good episodes if the right viewer was watching them. So you know what, it may be close, but I think this is still a good season overall. It's not that far above being an okay season, especially with the first half, but the second half of episodes was all around really good. And I just have to say, there was a lot of world building in this season. And on that note, well, let's move on to my notes. First off, it really does feel like time is circular in this show. A lot of previously established events and holidays are actually making a return in this season. The Running of the Leaves from For All Weather Friends, Her Swarming Eve from, well, Her Swarming Eve, Nightmare Night from Luna Eclipsed. And those are just a few examples. It really makes Equestria feel alive. And speaking of this world feeling more alive, we get to see a lot more of the world as well. The map of friendship is in full force in this season, and it's really showing how well it actually handles a lot of these adventure plots. It seems like only the ponies that are needed are being summoned. And so far, I haven't found any instances where it feels like any ponies were mismatched for the job. And depending on the mission, we get to see some old characters return as well, like Coco Pomel from Rarity Takes Manehattan, or Gilda from Griffon the Brushoff. And speaking of Gilda, you notice how this season had lots of redemptions to previous antagonists and some villains? It feels like the show from this point forward is going to focus a lot more on unity between all the different races of Equestria. We already saw Gilda, so who knows, maybe some changelings will be reformed too. But that's for Season 6. One thing's for sure though, some reformations were better than others. I still think that Diamond Tiara had the best reformation of any character in this season. And any beyond Gilda and Diamond Tiara, well, I'll be honest, I did not think were very good. If I were to watch each episode more than twice, I could probably rant a lot more about Starlight's reformation. Because even though I believe in forgiveness, I also believe in consequences. And given all she did in the Cutie Map and what she tried to do in the Cutie Re-Mark, well, let's just say I hate her already. But yeah, on the note of Starlight, this season focused a lot on cutie marks. They're used to some of the main 6 on friendship problems. We have characters now that are meant to try and decipher the true meaning of a cutie mark for specific ponies. And the way the matter is handled in episodes like, say, Bloom and Gloom is actually really mature. And then there are my other notes that don't really fit into anywhere. Like, for example, me no longer thinking Pinkie Pie is worth main 6. Yeah, Pinkie Pie was great this season all around. Even the one bad episode she had, I really liked her in it. Which really seems to me like my wish in Season 4 really came true. But will my wish for Season 6 be honored? Only time will tell. And speaking about time, I think it's about time I got to say to you all that's watching this video right now that I'm sorry. I know that for a while, I basically disappeared off the face of the earth as far as making these videos. Truth of the matter is that I'm generally really busy nowadays. And so some things just have to take a back seat because I can't focus on watching My Little Pony as often as I like to. Also, the early half of Season 5 really burned me out quick. You know, I want to enjoy the show when I'm watching it. I hate calling episodes nightmares because I feel like it's not justifying the reason I like this show so much. Honestly, it's a miracle I called the season good because after this, I heard that the show doesn't get much better. And if Season 6 through 9 are only going to get worse from this point onward, well, I am very worried. But alas, that's for a later date. Hopefully, I am at least more frequent with updating these series than I have been before in the past few months. So without further ado, what are my worst and best 5 episodes of Season 5? As always, let's start with the worst. 5th worst, Appleoosa's Most Wanted. On top of this episode not being very entertaining, it's just kinda depressing to watch. The story itself is bad, and regarding cutie marks, it really only adds more confusion, which is the last thing the subject needs more of. 4th worst, do princesses dream of magic sheep? For all the good this episode has, the ending absolutely murdered it. It really cheapens the effects of psychological trauma, and the lack of Princess Celestia at all is really off-putting. 3rd worst, the Cutie Re-Mark. Not only does this episode make me absolutely dread Season 6, what with the fact that Starlight's reformation has to be the absolute worst in the series so far, but this episode is all over the place. And you can't sell me in theories without showing your work. 2nd worst, what about Discord? It's boring and is played with horrible character derailment. And finally, number 1. In my opinion, the worst episode of Season 5 is Princess Spike. See, this episode especially pissed me off. Nothing in the story makes sense. The message that Spike is supposed to learn is inapplicable because of how the events actually play out and the order they do. And the only things to really come back to bite him are what he had to do to actually honor what Princess Cadance asked him to do. This episode places way too much responsibility on a literal baby dragon, and it scapegoats him for everything that goes wrong. All for it to just come crumbling down under the absolute most Murphy's Law level circumstances. As of now in the show, this is my most hated episode. I hate it more than Finley Pikachu, I hate it more than Dragon Quest, I even hate it more than Spike at Your Service and Power Ponies. Gosh, no more of these Let's Bully Spike episodes, they suck. But this is why we end these videos on a high note. So how about the best episodes of Season 5? Well, let's talk about them. 5th best, the Cutie Map. Between this and Return of Harmony, I'm not quite sure which is my favorite season opener. But this one is an absolute cult classic. Pun entirely intended. Not only is the story fascinating, but I love how this episode actually uses friendship and have it actually mean something beyond some kind of laser. Not to mention, we got to see both Fluttershy and Pinkie Pie really shine in this episode. 4th best, the main attraction. Not only is it beautiful, but it has some really good music, but it also has to be one of the absolute best Applejack episodes we've ever gotten. And hey, the moral about being yourself is actually good. 3rd best, Brotherhooves Social. Just an all-around excellent episode. Good comedy, a lot of heart, and seeing where tertiary characters really has to be more common in this show. Because there's a lot more to explore if you actually give them a chance to really show their stuff. 2nd best, Amending Fences. This one is a lot more personal than most others, But the moral the Moondancer learns in this episode really resonates with me, and he gives a lot of insight as to what could have possibly happened if Twilight just stayed in Canterlot. Definitely a keeper in any case. And finally, my favorite episode of Season 5, Crusaders of the Lost Mark. Just an all-around excellent story, and a fantastic celebration for the CMC and all they've gone through since Season 1. And you know, I'm actually excited to see what they do in Season 6. With that, I bestow them the highest of marks for the season. So yeah, Season 6, tell me about it. And eventually, I'll make the video on that season as well. But until next time, this is Arantula signing out, and thank you for watching.